The Carter family drove into Marrow's Hollow just as the sun dipped behind the hills, turning the sky into a bruise of purple and black. Their station wagon rolled along cracked asphalt streets that were too wide for a town this small, flanked by houses whose windows looked as if they hadn't seen light in years. The air smelled faintly of mildew and rust, like something wet had been left out to rot. Mark Carter, behind the wheel, tried to keep his voice cheerful as he pointed out their new home, a Victorian rental with a sagging porch and a tall, blackened church standing sentinel across the street. Emily Carter didn't respond. She was staring at the church, its steeple leaning as though dragged down by the weight of centuries. Its stained glass windows glowed faintly, though the doors were chained shut. A rusted iron cross hung crooked at the top, streaked with dark stains that looked too much like dried blood to be dismissed. Inside the house, the air was heavy with damp wood and something metallic. Noah, their youngest, immediately set his toy cars on the floor, trying to make the place his own. Lila, their teenage daughter, drifted to the upstairs window that faced the church. She swore she saw a candle flicker inside, even though the place looked abandoned. When she blinked, it was gone, leaving only the warped reflection of dusk. That night, while unpacking, Emily opened an old hymn book she found shoved into the back of a cupboard. The pages were stuck together with brown stains that cracked when she pried them apart. Some pages were torn, and others had strange additions, crude drawings of figures with hollow faces, scrawled in a hand that pressed so hard it tore the paper. Near the back, the pages reeked faintly of iron. She pressed her fingers to one smear and pulled them back wet. The stain wasn't old, it was fresh. She didn't tell Mark. He was already tense, pacing through the creaking hallways. Instead, she wrapped the book in a dish towel and shoved it under the sink. But when she turned, she thought she saw Noah staring at her with wide eyes. "Mom," he whispered, "there's a man in the church window." Emily looked, but there was nothing. Still, her stomach tightened. The next morning, as the kids waited for the school bus, Lila noticed something half buried in the dirt near the porch. It was a brass key, its bow etched with a small crucifix and the initials, SPI. The metal was warm to the touch despite the cool morning air, almost as if it had been clenched in someone's fist moments before. She pocketed it without telling anyone. When the bus left, Mark wandered into town to buy groceries. The general store was run by a gray-bearded man with milky eyes. He barely looked at Mark as he rang up the items. When Mark mentioned the church across from their new home, the man's hand stilled. He whispered without looking up, "You keep your family away from that place. It eats what it can't bless." Then he shoved the bag across the counter with a trembling hand. That night, Noah woke screaming. Emily rushed to his room and found him pointing at the wall. The wallpaper was bulging outward as if something inside the wall was pressing against it, something wet and shifting. A long dark stain seeped through the plaster, dripping slowly to the floor. It smelled sharp, coppery, blood. Mark pulled Noah away, but when he turned back, the bulge was gone, the wall flat and dry. Only the metallic stench lingered, clinging to the back of their throats. Later, Emily dreamt of the church. She walked down its aisle lined with broken pews, the floor slick beneath her shoes. When she looked down, she realized she was ankle-deep in blood, thick and warm, carrying with it scraps of hair, teeth, and bone that swirled in lazy eddies. At the altar, a figure stood cloaked in shadow, whispering hymns backward. Its face was hidden, but when it raised its hands, they dripped scarlet, and the dripping never stopped. She woke gasping, her sheets damp with sweat and streaked with small smears of red that hadn't been there before dawn by the third day. The family stopped pretending. The house was wrong. The church was worse. Lila confessed to her mother about the key. When Emily touched it, a jolt ran up her arm. And in her mind, she saw flashes of a basement lined with crucifixes turned upside down, jars filled with floating organs, and children's shoes stacked neatly in the corner. She dropped the key, but it rolled on its own toward the church, stopping at the gate as though it knew where it belonged. That evening, Mark decided to confront it. "It's just a building," he said, forcing a laugh. "Some old town superstition. I'll prove it." He crossed the street at dusk, flashlight in hand, his boots crunching gravel. The church doors were chained, but when he touched the keyhole, the brass key in Lila's pocket vibrated, almost humming. Against her will, she walked after him, pulled like a magnet. When she pressed the key into the lock, the chain snapped like brittle bone, falling to the ground with a clatter. The doors swung open on their own. Inside, the air reeked of decay. Pews were splintered, their wood soaked dark in patches. Something glistened on the floorboards, thick streaks that led toward the altar. Mark's flashlight caught shapes along the walls, flayed animal carcasses nailed like grotesque saints, eyes removed, mouths frozen in silent screams. Above them, Latin prayers were scrawled in what looked unmistakably like dried blood. Emily stepped in last, clutching Noah's hand so tightly his knuckles whitened. The boy whimpered, pointing at the altar. There, laid out on the cracked stone, was a body. What was left of one? It looked mummified at first, skin stretched tight, but as they drew closer, they realized the body was fresh. Its chest cavity was split wide, ribs pried apart like a grotesque cage. The organs were missing. Blood still dripped in sluggish rivulets down the altar, pooling on the floor. The smell was suffocating. Noah screamed, and his voice echoed through the hollow space. From the shadows, something stirred. A wet shuffle, followed by the distinct sound of a chain dragging. The candlelight flared, though none of them had lit a candle. Figures seemed to move in the aisles, half-glimpsed, their shapes gaunt and dripping. Lila clutched her notebook to her chest, her nails digging into the paper until they tore. Mark raised his flashlight and shouted, "Who's there?" His voice shook. The beam caught a face in the dark, a pale mask with eyes sewn shut and lips sewn open, blood crusted where the thread pierced skin. It lurched forward, a grotesque parody of worship, hands outstretched and fingers tipped with sharpened nails caked in filth. Behind it, more shapes emerged, each worse than the last. A woman with no jaw, a child with its skull caved in but still grinning, a priest whose stomach was slit open, intestines dragging like ropes. Emily gagged as bile rose in her throat. She pulled Noah back, but the boy's feet slipped on the slick floor, sending him crashing down into the pool of blood at the altar's base. When she yanked him up, his pajamas were soaked, clinging red, and in his hair, a scrap of something soft and gray clung. She realized with horror it was brain matter. Mark swung the flashlight wildly, and in its beam, they saw the walls pulsing. The plaster split in long cracks, and through them spilled worms, beetles, and clumps of what looked like raw meat. The church itself seemed to breathe, each inhale rattling like a death rattle, each exhale carrying the thick stench of rot. Emily shrieked, "We have to get out now." She dragged Noah toward the door, but it slammed shut with a thunderous boom. The figures advanced, their bodies twitching unnaturally, their wounds dripping fresh blood that pattered on the floor. Somewhere deeper in the church, a bell tolled once, low and hollow, and every candle flared brighter, revealing more horrors. Flayed skin stretched like parchment across the rafters, human teeth strung into rosaries, tongues nailed into hymnals. Lila, pale and trembling, pulled the brass key from her pocket. It pulsed with heat, almost burning her hand. She whispered, "It wants us here." The church groaned in agreement. The sound of the door slamming reverberated through their bones. Dust rained from the rafters, coating them in a gray film that stank faintly of ashes. The figures advancing from the shadows moved with jerky, unnatural rhythm as those strings pulled them forward. Their sewn mouths opened impossibly wide, threads snapping weightly, and a chorus of hollow moans spilled into the church. Thick and broken like something dragged across stone, Emily clutched Noah to her chest, but the boy squirmed, eyes wide with terror, staring at the altar. The mangled body upon it twitched. At first it seemed like some trick of their imagination, a nerve spasm. Then the ribcage rose, bones creaking as though the body inhaled. A gush of dark blood spilled from the cavity, slapping weightly onto the floor, carrying with it something lumpy and pale. A heart. It thudded once on the wood, still beating faintly before bursting like an overripe fruit. Mark gagged, but forced himself to step in front of his family, flashlight beam cutting through the thick air. It landed on the priest-like figure at the head of the aisle. His stomach cavity hung open, intestines slopping with each dragging step. His collar was still intact, a filthy white square in the ruin of his neck, and in his hand he held a rusted chalice filled to the brim with something red and pulpy. When he raised it, the other corpses echoed him, arms raised, blood dripping from their fingertips onto the warped floorboards. Lila's hand burned where she clutched the key. The heat was unbearable, but when she tried to throw it, her fingers locked. Her head filled with whispers Latin, fragments of hymns twisted into something obscene. She dropped to her knees, clutching her ears, but the sound came from inside her skull. Through blurred eyes, she saw the pews melt. Wood softened like flesh, sloughing into piles of gristle threaded with splinters. Wriggling with maggots, Emily pulled her daughter upright, screaming her name, but the floor beneath them gave a wet shudder. The blood pooled around their shoes thickened, and small hands pressed up through it, clutching at their ankles. Tiny children's hands, skinless, bones glistening, nails black. Noah screamed as one tore a strip from his pajama leg, leaving behind a smear of crimson as it clawed his calf. Emily kicked, but the hands kept rising, dragging at them. Their grip cold and slimy. Mark charged forward with a shout, swinging the flashlight like a weapon. It cracked into the sewn-eyed man's skull with a crunch, splitting the head open. Instead of bone and brain, a torrent of writhing worms and chunks of rotten meat exploded out, showering Mark's face and chest. He stumbled back, gagging, wiping at his eyes as the worms burrowed into his skin, disappearing beneath the flesh, leaving bulges that wriggled under the surface. His scream echoed until it broke into a gurgle. The priest's figure lifted his chalice and began to chant, his exposed lungs quivering with each word. The walls answered. Crucifixes spun upside down, nailed tongues wriggling and dripping pus. From above, a long strip of stretched skin fluttered like a banner, painted with fresh blood forming words Emily couldn't understand but felt deep in her marrow. Lila staggered to her feet, clutching the burning key. "It's calling me," she whispered, her voice hollow. Her eyes rolled back, whites glowing faintly. "It wants us inside." Emily slapped her, hard enough to snap her out of it. Blood splattered from Lila's nose, but she blinked back to herself, trembling. The key pulsed, and suddenly, the altar split open down the center, revealing a staircase plunging into darkness. The chanting grew louder, layered with hundreds of voices. The creatures around them dropped to their knees, clawing their faces bloody as though in reverence. The carters were shoved forward by an unseen force. Their feet slipped on the gore-slick wood as they descended. The walls of the staircase were lined with niches, each cradling something unspeakable. Skulls cracked open like bowls filled with blackened organs, infants mummified yet still twitching, jars of yellow fluid with severed hands pressed against the glass. The air grew hotter and thicker, the copper stench choking them at the bottom. They entered a cavernous crypt. Dozens of pews carved from bone faced a massive altar built of stacked corpses, their faces frozen in silent screams. A crucifix hung above, but instead of Christ, a skin body was nailed there, muscles exposed and twitching, eyes rolling in agony though lips were sewn shut. Its blood dripped steadily into a basin below, where a writhing mass of pale, eyeless creatures lapped greedily. Emily retched, but nothing came up. Noah clung to her, sobbing, whispering, "I want to go home. I want to go home." His cries echoed too loud, swallowed by the cavern. The priest appeared behind them, intestines dragging weightly, chalice still raised. He dipped his hand into the basin and smeared blood across his stitched mouth, the threads snapping one by one as he grinned wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. Mark staggered, clutching his stomach where the worms had burrowed. His skin stretched and split as dozens of tiny heads pressed out from beneath, gnashing with needle-like teeth. His screams turned into guttural growls. He dropped to his knees, clawing at his own flesh, ripping strips free that flapped weightly from his hands. Emily tried to grab him, but he shoved her away, eyes wild. "Get them out of me," he shrieked before tearing open his own stomach. A cascade of wriggling, squealing creatures spilled onto the floor, splattering in the blood. They scuttled immediately toward the children, snapping at their ankles. Emily kicked and stomped, crushing some under her heel, but more came. Lila pressed the burning key against the altar of corpses. The flesh sizzled, filling the air with the stench of cooking meat. A shriek erupted from every corpse at once, a deafening choir of agony. The skinned figure on the crucifix writhed violently, its blood spraying in great arcs, coating them all. The priest lunged, grabbing Lila's wrist, forcing the key deeper. His flesh fused to hers, veins blackening, their screams blending. Emily pulled at her daughter, but her hand slipped in the torrent of blood. Noah shrieked as one of the eyeless creatures latched onto his arm, biting deep. He yanked free, leaving behind a strip of flesh that dangled loosely, bone flashing beneath. He fainted, blood pumping in spurts. Emily snapped. She grabbed the key with both hands, ignoring the searing pain, and wrenched it from the altar. The cavern shuddered violently, walls cracking, corpses spilling from their stacked altar in rivers of gore. The priest howled as his body split, bursting apart in a geyser of blood and organ fragments that rained across the crypt. The crucified figure above tore free, crashing into the pews with a wet splat, twitching as if trying to crawl toward them. The ground split beneath their feet. Blood gushed upward, drowning the cavern. Emily held Noah's limp body against her chest, screaming for Lila. Her daughter's face was pale, eyes rolling, but she still clutched the key, glowing brighter, melting into her hand until it was bone-fused with metal. She whispered, "It's not done. It's never done." The torrent carried them upward, through collapsing tunnels, bursting out into the nave of the church. The doors flew open, spewing them onto the steps as blood cascaded down into the street. Townsfolk emerged from their houses, but instead of running, they knelt in the flood, scooping handfuls to their mouths, drinking, laughing through crimson-stained teeth. Emily screamed at them to help, but they only chanted in unison, "Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus." Their voices droned as the church behind her groaned, steeple snapping, windows shattering outward in explosions of glass and gore. 1,000 faces pressed against the broken panes, faces without eyes, without lips, all screaming silently as blood poured endlessly into the night. Mark's body floated past, half devoured, his chest hollow. Noah twitched in Emily's arms, whispering something she couldn't understand. Lila stood, soaked in gore, the key fused into her flesh glowing brighter, her smile spreading wider than her face should allow. Emily staggered back, but the crowd surged toward her, arms outstretched, teeth gnashing. The church bell tolled once, then again, louder, shaking the earth. Lila raised her fused hand high, and the bell cracked, spilling molten metal like rain. The last thing Emily saw before the wave. Consumed her was her daughter's glowing hand reflected in the flood, and the stitched mouth of the priest, whispering from somewhere inside her skull, "Welcome home."